thrilled today to have Bob Hauser. And Bob and I met in an interesting way. So one of my dearest longtime friends, Dexter Janet Barrowman, is a cancer survivor. And about 10 years ago, when she had started to go through her cancer journey, she was part of a photography, and Bob, you can correct me if I use the incorrect term, a photography exposition and exhibition. And Bob was the individual who, as you can see in the background there, and he'll talk about that a bit, is some of the photographs from what he did. And I just found it moving at that time. And then fast forwarding about 10 years or so, I came across something on LinkedIn. I saw Bob and I connected with Bob, and here we are today. I just thought it'd be a great topic to talk about, especially related to the impact that photography can have on caregivers, patients, et cetera. So I'm going to just pass on to Bob and ask him to share a little bit about his professional background and specific to photography. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you. I have been photographing people for 30 years or so, maybe a little longer than that, because that dates me. I started out in this world as a travel photographer, photographing adventure travel, and traveled all around the world for a travel company, and then started working in the adventure travel space, running, mountain biking, that kind of thing. And then during the dot-com days of the mid to late 90s, I started photographing people more specifically focusing on portraiture for magazines, and most of them obviously in the Silicon Valley computer world space. And we photographed everybody in that realm during that crazy time. And then after the economy went to poop, the rest of us kind of had to change gears a little bit. And I started doing more annual report work, and specifically in the healthcare space. And that kind of lit my fire a little bit more than previously. I started photographing a lot of rare disease patients. And that's the main thrust of my business now, is photographing people for pharmaceutical firms, usually in the orphan drug world. So I get to travel around the country and meet some really interesting people. And so that's been quite fascinating. And as an adjunct to that, I had started this cancer project, which we talked about, and it was called Facing Chemo. I originally started it by accidentally, when I was photographing a woman for a magazine. She said, "I'm about to lose my hair from chemotherapy." And I thought, well, I really need to kind of reel her back into this. And now that she's thinking about her chemo experience that she's about to have, I've kind of lost her for the shoot that I was trying to do. It had nothing to do with healthcare. It was just for her job and for a magazine story we were doing. And I immediately looked at her and thought, what if I offered to photograph her when she loses her hair? Maybe in some way that could be something she'd want to take with her going forward, to just have to kind of, commemorate the experience is not really the right word, but to kind of be able to reflect back on it. And I also knew that she was going to be stunning without hair. And I thought that's something to, again, celebrate is not the word, but I just thought that it might be something I could give her. And I thought by offering it, maybe I could kind of change the focus in that immediate time, which I was trying to do, was to kind of bring her away from the negative thoughts that she was about to start going in. Anyway, she was in her late 20s, wasn't going to hear anything of it, and kind of that pretty much ended the shoot. And lo and behold, 4.5, 5 years later, she called me up out of the blue and she said, "Would you photograph me? But does your offer still stand?" And I said, "In a heartbeat." And so literally the next day, on a rainy day in San Francisco, I photographed her with the light of an air shaft, and we sat and drank tea, and I ate a lot of her chocolate. And this was during her second round of chemo, when she was about to undergo a bone marrow transplant. Literally like 2-3 days from the time that I photographed her. And it was an amazing experience, but maybe I shouldn't get too far into that just yet.
No, that's great. That really helps frame your background relative to that. So I know we talked offline about this. I'm curious for the audience to hear what the impact was. And let's first start about what the impact of that cancer photography, what it had on you first and foremost.
Yeah, that was sort of the interesting thing, because up until then, I had been photographing people for, well, it was probably about 20 years or so. And as we talked before, you as a person can put forth to the camera what you want. And depending on the skill of the photographer, with their ability to communicate or get you at ease or trick you or manipulate you one way or another, to get you into being where they think you ought to be, to present your true self, as some people like to imply, you're still able to kind of direct things, I think. And that was totally out the window when I photographed somebody with chemotherapy. And I thought, what is it about that? And I noticed it more when I was editing the images than when I was shooting them, because I still could kind of feel in our dialogue kind of what she wanted me to feel. But when I was looking at the images later, I thought, wow, there's a genuineness to this that I haven't ever experienced while editing images. And it just was something that kind of hit me raw after the fact. And I thought, I'm really intrigued. And honestly, I was academically intrigued. And I take this as a non-selfish thing, or as a selfish thing. I was selfishly, academically intrigued with wanting to photograph more people undergoing chemotherapy, just to experience this genuine reality of their emotions being present, literally like right on the front of their face. And that's how I have gone on to describe it, that someone undergoing chemotherapy cannot hide. They cannot hide what they're thinking. And what they're thinking at 9:01 might not be what they're thinking at 9:03. And you can literally see it change when you're looking at the images. And that to me was fascinating. At the time, I attributed it to the loss of hair and the kind of just being out in society. And I have later learned, after experiencing photographing so many people, that it has a lot to do, honestly, with the drugs themselves. And people will talk about chemo brain, or they'll just suddenly start crying on a subway for seemingly no reason. And that's a lot of what I'm talking about. It's that that genuine connection to their emotions that they're experiencing, that I think the photographer experiences, and then that the photographer can show to the viewer in a way that I couldn't do photographing some executive, or some random athlete.
Absolutely. Well, that really explains the impact that it has on you and the evolution to that. What would you say from being in the moment with them when you're doing the photography and that project, to afterwards, any feedback that you've gotten? I know, like at the exhibition that I went to in Oakland, that was up in, I think, the Piedmont Hills there. What did you sense and what did you hear in terms of the impact that your photography and the whole experience had on the patients themselves?
Yeah, that was something that that was honestly humbling to me. And I photographed maybe 30 or 40 people in total. And when we had the first exhibit of this space, I still felt like I had been taking something from all of these folks. I still felt like this was something that was kind of about me. And I had envisioned this room full of these very large prints. And I succeeded in creating this exhibit, but I still felt like I hadn't done anything for them. That I had taken something from all of these people because I was so academically intrigued with this. Let's keep moving forward. Let's shoot another one. These prints are going to be amazing. This is going to have a great effect on people. This is going to be an amazing exhibit. But at that event, I said to everybody, you know, I want to invite you all back to a picnic a year from now. And so they all came and we had this giant picnic a year after the first exhibit. And maybe, I don't know, 12 families came and we had things for them to do. And my kids helped me make piñatas for their kids. And it was a really fun afternoon, but part of it, I wanted to photograph everybody again. And what we ended up doing was creating an exhibit called Facing Chemo Before and After. And so I had everybody in the studio space one at a time. And to a person, they said to me, you know, being photographed was a turning point in my journey. And that was shocking to me. They said, you know, I saw myself differently after that. And it sort of changed my trajectory, even if it was just my emotional trajectory. And to me, I was like, okay, done. I don't need this exhibit to go anywhere else. You know, like my part of it has been completely fulfilled just to hear folks say that, because it kind of changed things in my mind, happily so. You know, and the woman who I first photographed, who is that one, wrote a little piece about this for the little book that we made for one of the exhibits. And she said, you know, up until then, for years, I had been photographed by MRI machines and X-rays and CT scans and PET scans. And they were all pictures of my disease. And I had gotten to the point that I couldn't look in the mirror. And she said, I couldn't even look into a dark car because all I would see is the reflection of the disease. And she said, being photographed by you made me see myself again in there. And I think in a way that was what I was getting at that 5 years earlier when I knew she was about to lose her hair. And I thought, you know, there's going to be a beauty there. I would love to give that to her. And she said, you know, I saw myself in there for the first time and I didn't see the disease. And you know, that the fact that I was able to give that to him was huge.
It is huge. It's powerful, no doubt. Along this journey, whether it was through exhibition or feedback that you received from people, did you hear much from healthcare workers and that were maybe they were caregivers, or whether it was personal caregivers or hospital-based, clinic-based caregivers about that project?
I did connect with a women's support group locally. And they were incredibly positive about it. So much so that they kept sending me people to photograph. And but in general, the folks came by themselves. Occasionally, Dexter being one of them, came with a friend, and I started to realize that that connection that often women shared with having a chemo buddy, I think is how it's phrased, was so supportive. You know, someone that they're going through it with, or someone that had gone through it, you know, in a, not exactly like a 12-step program sponsor, but a similar kind of friendship. And I actually photographed a couple people like that together, and that itself was kind of unique and interesting. I actually photographed a couple that had cancer at the same time. And one of them had gone through radiation first and then chemo, and the other one had gone through chemo and then radiation. And I photographed them together, and that was sort of moving. The video of that was really sort of moving. They didn't say anything. They just sat there and looked at the camera, but they were kind of wrapped up in each other. And yeah.
Incredibly powerful. I know I keep using that word, but it is every time I hear you talk about it and every time I see it, but certainly to hear the experience that you have had with this and the journey. So the fourth impact, what I'll call, is on people like me, who I wasn't a patient, I wasn't a healthcare worker at the time. I was a friend of Dexter, and who walked into this exhibition and was incredibly moved by this. And it took me to a whole other level of awareness. I mean, I had an awareness in and of my friend and other friends in the past, but the scope of what you did and the magnitude of that just had such a big impact on me. So how has that been for you, and hearing from others? And I would imagine you've run across other me's, so to speak.
Yeah. No, that's been really interesting. I mean, these prints are huge. They're 4 feet, so the heads alone are gigantic. And photographing them against black, I think, had the effect of making the viewer not able to run away. And I mean not able to run away in that you couldn't rationalize in your head stories about them. They weren't being photographed in a hospital setting. So you couldn't say, oh, phew, they're getting the care they need, or they weren't being photographed with family members or in their kitchen, you know. So you couldn't mentally say, oh, at least they're able to go through their day-to-day life. So you couldn't escape the emotions. It was just there. And if you're going to stand in front of it, you're going to experience it. And I think that had a lot to do with how it was received. I'll tell you 2 interesting stories. At the first exhibit, a woman came up to me and she said, I can't believe you're showing this image. And it just happened to be one of my favorite images in the exhibit. And I thought that the woman's eyes were amazing. And I told her, it's like, you have just the most interesting looking eyes. It would be so cool to be able to sit across the table from you every night and just see your eyes. And I found so much hope in her eyes in that image. But the woman said to me, this is the saddest and almost meanest image in the whole exhibit. And I was like, wow. I mean, it just that image hit a chord with that person to be able to have that completely different emotion that other people were having. And then in one of the other later exhibits, when it was in a downtown setting, there were pictures in the windows. So at that one, people didn't know what they were coming to when they walked in. And I thought that was really different for me to experience the folks who came in, because they didn't know what they were getting into. It's not like they read a flyer and said, facing chemo exhibit, come and see, or my friend was in a project, I want to go and see the other images in it. So these folks came in off the street, and this woman came to the door of the gallery, you know, and there's 20 giant images hanging around the gallery. And I happened to be there, and I said, come on in. And she said, no, I'm good here. And I was like, no, really, you can come in. And she said, no, I really wanted to see this. I really needed to see this, but this is as far as I can get. If I get any closer, it's too much. And that in itself was sort of, I mean, to be able to move people by your work is crazy. To be able to help folks in their journey, that was a gift for me. But to be able to move people by them just looking at it was equally rewarding.
Yes. Once again, powerful. Wow. Yeah, thanks for sharing all of that. So let's move on to another topic that you and I have chatted about offline. which is initially why I connected with you, which was having known your work through Dexter and then having been reintroduced on LinkedIn, I instantly went to where my life has been and all that I've seen relative to caregivers. And being one myself for both of my parents, and everything that I do and have done for them over the past 4 years, I've always imagined, where do I sit? Not always. It happens at times where I said, okay, and I always say things could be a lot tougher. Things could be a lot tougher, because everything's relative, and I believe everything's on a continuum in life. So I know a lot of caregivers who are dealing with a lot more in ways, a lot more hands-on, a lot more intense situations, up until this point that I have. But I thought, wow, how powerful would it be to capture caregivers? And in what way would you capture caregivers to get that message, so you're not dismissing the patient, because the patient often is the one that is being focused on, but how do you capture the caregiver and what that caregiver does? And I know we chatted about this last week, and I know you have thought about this as well, and especially related to what you personally deal with in your family. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about that, so the audience can hear how you've thought about it.
Yeah, so I should kind of give an explanation about what I'm doing with these projects, because I was about to say in my professional life. After this project, Facing Chemo, I started a nonprofit so that we could continue to create exhibits around medical related issues. And the discussion that you and I have had about doing something with caregivers would fall under that umbrella. In my professional life, photographing people with rare diseases, I am constantly amongst families and these parents or outside caregivers that come in and help out with some of these kids with these diseases that I photograph. It's an amazing experience to see. I get what I consider the easy part of it. People say, okay, is that really depressing work to be photographing, kids with rare diseases? And I get to spend, an afternoon with the kid and be in the kid's world and photograph life through their eyes and just what they are doing and being, and then a 6-year-old kid is, whether they have a disease or not, is going to be full of energy. And so I get to kind of play with that. But all the while, I'm seeing and witnessing and being around what their parents, their fathers and their mothers are doing, and how they are subsisting. And that's fascinating. And I have never focused my lens on them. But I have always thought about doing a project on caregivers. And oddly, I think it's because, the caregivers around, as we've talked, my father has Alzheimer's, and he has a lot of help. And then I go and spend time with him. And I have always focused in my mind caregivers as being someone with the elderly. And I have never actually broadened my mind and thought about all the different caregivers out there. And when we spoke last week, it sort of started a snowball in my mind about how this project might come to fruition. And any project like this has to percolate for a long time. And I say percolate because I kind of think that's how your creative mind kind of comes upon something. Some things just fall into place. This chemo project fell into place because she said, would you photograph me? And I was like, yes, sure. And she said, would you photograph me tomorrow? And I said, yes. And I get there and I'm like, but I haven't thought about this. How am I going to photograph you? well, I just happened to have done this new lighting technique with my kids, so let's try that. And it, you know, it worked. Others take a lot of effort to try. And we discussed how I tried to photograph aging, and I wanted to do a piece on aging. And I photographed maybe 45 different octo and nonagenarians. And it just didn't have the impact that I wanted it to have. And so now, you know, in thinking about this caregiver work, I at least have been opened up now to think of it as meaning not just people taking care of folks who are much older, but people who are anything. And, you know, I talked about how we, last week I was on the mountain, I was skiing, and there was a blind woman standing in front of me getting her ski pass for the day. And she said to the person behind the window, "This is my guide." And I thought, you know, how expanding is that to just think that, I mean, that's caregiving to another degree. This person is allowing this blind person to ski down a mountain. That's huge. How do I photograph it? I don't know. I'm not there yet. I like I said, is the focus of the image on the caregiver? Is the focus on the image on the person being cared for, with the caregiver being present? I feel like they both need to be there. Otherwise, it's a portrait of one or the other. And honestly, I don't think it's a portrait per se that tells the story at least that I feel like is there to, that I would want to tell. I feel like the story is the word care, and the care exists between these two bodies. I think that's what you're photographing, is that space. So not the person on either end of it. Yeah, so that's going to take some pictorializing mental gymnastics. And honestly, what it's really going to take for me is to just do it. And I was having a conversation with some young photographers who want to photograph people after having gone through chemo. And they said what we were going to do is give these folks a hair and makeup person come and a whole kind of wardrobe change. And I said, yeah, do that. But also shoot the before and the during, because you don't know where the exhibit's going to be. You don't know where the interest is going to be for you. And if it's interesting for you, that's going to do two things. One, motivate you to continue to shoot them. And two, that interest is going to carry on to the viewer. And so I said, you just have to play, put yourself in the situation and then play, shoot everything. And that's what I will do when I start to photograph the Caregiver project, is literally just spend time and have my camera there. And in a way, it's the way I photograph these kids with, you know, the rare disease work. It's just be there. And preconceived notions go out the window when you're photographing a 4-year-old who is on the spectrum and has a rare disease and all kinds of other needs. And, you know, literally it's 4 seconds at this activity and then boing, he's going to go over there and then he's over there. So it's a lot of rolling with the punches. And I think that's what that's the frame of mind I will take in looking at caregiving. But yeah, I think the key is the space in between the two bodies.
So if I can say it sounds like art, it's artistry. I mean, it's like a canvas. If you're, for any painter, they see the canvas, and as they're moving along, they're feeling it out and they're moving along. And I picture, of course, just from movies, but Jackson Pollock or, you know, whoever it might be, and how they're just sort of feeling it out. And I imagine it's similar where you're going, you have a preconceived notion of where you're going to start, but how that evolves, you're feeling it out in the situation?
I think that's what comes with time, and with experience. The 10,000 hours thing that folks talk about with Olympic athletes. In the beginning, I could say I want to photograph somebody, and I could go in, or I could have an idea, or I could see them, and I could take the picture and make it work, and maybe it's great. But to do an exhibit, I think you have to have this cord that runs through. You have to have, I think of it as a river or a stream that runs through all the images. And the only way to be able to make that make sense is to have experienced a lot of them over time, and to have allowed yourself to roll and move and bear witness, to it. It's one thing, yeah, as a 22-year-old, I could have gone out and said, okay, I'm going to photograph this caregiver, and here's this person that this person takes care of, and I'd get some nice images of them and some nice images of that. But would I see what's going on in between? And that's the stuff that's interesting. Would I see the dropping of the handkerchief and the picking it up of the handkerchief, and the knowing that that handkerchief was something that this person carried around for 80 years, and that person who picked it up knows that that's important for that person to have in their hand. Would I have gotten that as a 22-year-old? I do not think so. Would I have seen it? No. Would I have taken a fine picture? Yes. But would it have maintained that movement or that theme, or actually shown the little subtle things? I don't think so. And I think, that's what a Jackson Pollock, or, some painter who has painted for 80 years, the curves that they're making at that moment has 80 years of experience behind it. And they've done it wrong for 72 years, and so even though it might be this infinitesimally small movement, it carries with it experience. And I think that experience and that bearing witness is something that, for example, if you're caregiving for somebody and you walk into somebody new, you could fulfill their daily needs. They'll be warm and they'll be fed and they'll be whatever. But will you be making a difference in their life? And I think that's what someone who has worked with someone for a long time knows and gains, and it is felt on the other end. They're not just moved from the bed to the bedpan, or, they're not just fed. They're little things. He likes his fork here, and that's the way, in my dad's experience, I know that that's what his mom said to him when he was 4. And now that he's in his 80s and has lost a lot of his capacity, things like that bring him comfort. I can see it.
Yeah, there's 2 things that I want to respond with there. There's a lot packed into that, which is great. One being, I go back to the word I used earlier, which is a premise I use throughout life, which is continuum. So there's the continuum of life. We all, hopefully, to whatever extent, in our own ways, learn over time, over years, over decades. And whatever it may be, whether we're painters, photographers, accountants, salespeople, whatever anybody is, you're hopefully learning how to do it better. But it's along the continuum, not necessarily an absolute right or wrong. We come to the table at any point in our lives, whether we're the 22-year-old, the 42-year-old, the 60-year-old, whatever it might be, with a whole set of experiences that we can pull into that moment in time.
Yeah.
And then the additional thing, which was you mentioned about being a caregiver and then stepping into somebody new. And it's true, I believe, definitely based upon that experience, you can bring that to somebody and bring those experiences and learn, okay, this is how I do something. This is intuitively, I think this is what this person can use in this moment. But I'm going to bring it all back around to, no matter what it is, whether it's your photography, my caregiving, anything, it comes back to relationships and trust. So you going in, well, let's start with a caregiver. It's about trust. So even with my parents, it's, yeah, sure, they trust me implicitly, but it's a different dynamic now. Now they were in the role of needing to accept care and trusting that. So, and that grows over time as you experience. It's shared experiences. It's like any relationship, you grow through shared experiences. So, but for instance, with a photographer, you may not have as much time to build a relationship like that. You may have calls or meetings and so forth. So it's really about how you're I would think, I'd love your opinion on this, is connecting with them, connecting with where you're going with this, and building that trust. Because I imagine if your subject is feeling that trust more, then there's going to be that energy and that connection, and it's going to come out in what's done, what's presented.
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about a normal non-chemo person being able to some degree, control the scenario in which they have found themselves. And the skill of the photographer being able to kind of break them out of wherever they happen to be if they're putting a wall up. And that comes from experience, and it comes from everything that you bring to the table, not just the machine you have in your hand and the technical knowledge that you have. I think a lot of it is your interpersonal skills. Just like taking care of someone goes beyond the food and warmth that you're providing. But I'll tell you an interesting story. Honestly, at some points in my career, I have thought of it as manipulation of somebody, and to a degree, it is. If I've got 20 minutes with someone, and I'm walking in, how am I going to get them to what I need? And in the most blunt description, I am manipulating them to a degree. But I find that it comes from observation, and my biggest tool that I can bring to any portrait assignment is observation and noticing things. And I am acutely aware of trying to notice things. And I'll tell you this story. I think you and I talked about it before, where I was photographing a woman who was in her late 20s, and she was the head of IT for a university. And the story was literally about hacking university systems. And so here's a woman in her 20s in the computer world for a story about hacking and protecting your IT network. And they said to me, we don't want her arms crossed and we want her smiling. So she comes to the shoot like this. And she had no intention of uncrossing her arms, and she had no intention of smiling. And I even said that jokingly. And she even said, yes, I will not be smiling. And so I took a handful of pictures and just started conversation. And then I just stopped. And I walked all the way. I was, probably 12, 15 feet away from her. And I walked all the way up close to her. And I said, by any chance, is the art downstairs yours? And she said, well, yeah, why do you ask? And I said, because the bracelet on your left hand has a pattern of 4 colors in the exact same color palette and pattern as one of the paintings in the downstairs lobby. And so she's like this. She uncrosses her arms, looks at her wrists, looks up at me and smiles. And for the rest of the 20 minutes, she was smiling and ready to be photographed. And it was just because I paid attention and made that little connection. And it's like you said, yeah, it's connections. So if you notice something, and a lot of times when I first start photographing someone, I'll suddenly talk about 13 of the most random topics until I find one that clicks. And often for me, it's locations and accents. And I can pick accents. I said to a guy once after I walked in and I said hello, and he said, "Hi, how are you?" And I just stopped and I said, 2 miles from Revere Beach. And he knew exactly what I was talking about. We were in California. Revere Beach is a beach north of Boston. And he looked at me and he said, 2.5, actually. I had placed his accent within a half mile of where he grew up by 3 words that he had said. And then, that was the same kind of thing. Super cold, anxious attorney about to be photographed, all of a sudden was warm and ready to be photographed.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. So the theme here is relationships. It's connecting with people, builds trust, and just helps in all aspects of life to wrap it all up. Well, I appreciate the time. This has been great hearing this, and hopefully the audience has enjoyed this as well. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. And I know we're going to talk more offline, more about the caregiving photography and some of the ideas that we were rolling around our heads last week. And
absolutely,
yeah, and I look forward to that a lot. So, we'll do that. And anybody in the audience who has any thoughts, we welcome comments and thoughts about that for sure, whether it's under this video or just contacting me or Bob. And I'll be posting Bob's information up there. So anybody who wants to get a hold of Bob for any of his professional work, that'd be great. So again, Bob, thanks so much. I will follow up. We'll be chatting very soon.
Sounds good. I appreciate it.
All right. Stay well.
Thank you. Do the same.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The primary purpose of the podcast is to educate. While guests are invited to listen, listeners acknowledge that they are not being provided professional advice from the podcast or any guests. One Day, One Week and its sponsor, 17 Commerce LLC, expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use the podcast episodes or the information presented in the episodes.